I've known Don since he came to Washington. When he first came to work for George W. Bush, he was a different Don Rumsfeld. He was jolly, full of life, and ready to go to war, but only if we could win. George W. Bush said the reason the Oval Office is round is there are no corners you can hide in. If George W. Bush is elected president, I'm leaving for France. George W. Bush is always protesting that he has the fate of the world in mind and bangs on about the freedom-loving peoples he's seeking to protect. I'd love to meet a freedom-hating people. The White House is giving George W. Bush intelligence briefings. You know, some of these jokes just write themselves. Do I trust Yasser Arafat? Of course not. Why should I? Why should anyone trust a politician, whether Shimon Peres, Ariel Sharon, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Benjamin Netanyahu, George W. Bush, or Yasser Arafat? The real terrorist threats are George W. Bush and his band of brown-shirt thugs. George W. Bush broke a mold 4 years ago. Even though he lost the popular vote, he governed as if he had won by acclamation. Beginning with the Clinton administration and rapidly accelerating with the George W. Bush and Obama regimes and Tony Blair in England, the US and UK governments have run roughshod over their accountability to law. Tony Blair will be remembered for nothing other than that he followed George W. Bush over a cliff, took the rest of us with them, and we haven't yet reached the bottom, I'm afraid. I am grateful to President George W. Bush for PEPFAR, which is saving the lives of millions of people in poor countries, and to both Presidents Bush for the work we've done together after the South Asia tsunami, Hurricane Katrina and the Haitian earthquake. The public's evaluation of the job George W. Bush is doing as president changed dramatically as a result of the horrific attacks of September 11 and his response in leading the country on a campaign against terrorism. The President of the United States of North America, George W. Bush, the little gentleman of the North, the political cadaver that is visiting South America. That little gentleman is the president of all the history of the United States, and in the history of the United States, he has the lowest level of approval in his own country. I fully appreciate the fact that George W. Bush won 49% of my district. George W. Bush has helped those who have most, hurt those who have least, and ignored everyone in between. In my lifetime, we've gone from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. We've gone from John F. Kennedy to Al Gore. If this is evolution, I believe that in 12 years, we'll be voting for plants. I am such a strong admirer and supporter of George W. Bush that if he suggested eliminating the income tax or doubling it, I would vote yes on first blush. If we are lucky, and George W. Bush is right, we are about to witness the war of the happy Iraqis. I think Karl Rove saw that in George W. Bush early on and understood the impact that he could have on Texas politics and probably on national politics. The erosion of privacy rights under the Fourth Amendment, written to protect us against unreasonable search and seizure, began in earnest under President George W. Bush. 9/11 was a deliberate, carefully planned evil act of the long-waged war on the West by Quran-inspired soldiers of Allah around the world. They hated us before George W. Bush was in office. They hated us before Israel existed, and the avengers of the religion of perpetual outrage will keep hating us. Having George W. Bush giving a lecture on business ethics is like having a leopard give you a facial, it just doesn't work. George W. Bush, a person who is the ultimate outcome of the American condition, someone promoted above ability because of circumstance and organization and empathy. You don't have to be intelligent. A moron in a hurry could know that you don't prevent war by having a war. People in my hometown voted for President Reagan. For many, like my grandpa, he was their first Republican, because he promised that tax cuts would bring higher wages and new jobs. It seemed he was right, so we voted for the next Republican promising tax cuts and job creation, George W. Bush. He wasn't right. George W. Bush and Tony Blair had to convince the world that Saddam Hussein represented an imminent threat. Tony Blair lied when he claimed that Iraq could launch a chemical or biological attack within 45 minutes. George W. Bush bought the election, period. End of story. There is no argument. You can try to come up with any argument you can, but there is none. George W. Bush and his administration embarked on a full-scale assault on civil liberties, human rights, and the rule of law, walking away from his international obligations, tearing up international treaties, protocols and UN conventions. In Trump's world, men get to play by different rules. Even the witch hunt over Hillary Clinton's emails exudes a double standard. George W. Bush lost 22 million emails during his presidency. We can't even go back and look at the communication regarding the decision to invade Iraq. I'm often asked what I think about the faith of the President George W. Bush. I think it is sincere. I think it's very real. I think it's deeply held. The one thing I'm convinced George W. Bush is good at is bipartisanship. It's clearly something he enjoys personally. George W. Bush attended the intelligence briefing every day. Obama has not even attended half of them. He sends surrogates. That to me is significant. Someday we'll learn the whole story of why George W. Bush brushed off that intelligence briefing of August 6, 2001. Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S., but surely a big distraction was the major speech he was readying for delivery on August 9, his first primetime address to the nation. From George Washington to George W. Bush, presidents have invoked God's name in the performance of their official duties. Tony Blair is a brilliant politician. Unfortunately, his legacy is entwined with George W. Bush because of Iraq. I've spent the last year listening to Americans, and the State of the Union that George W. Bush lives in is very different from the state that most hardworking Americans are living in. So the Republican Party of Teddy Roosevelt and John McCain and Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush is dead. It's over. It doesn't exist anymore. When George W. Bush was president, his daddy was raising money for the Bush Library. I thought that was fine. When Bob Dole was majority leader, Elizabeth Dole was the president of American Red Cross. I didn't say anything. I met Gerald Ford. I met Richard Nixon. I met Jimmy Carter. I met Dwight Eisenhower when he was a general. George Bush Sr. I haven't met Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, although I got a letter from him. My father didn't know George W. Bush from Adam. In order to understand why George W. Bush doesn't get it, you have to take several strands of common Texas attitude, then add an impressive degree of class-based obliviousness. What you end up with is a guy who sees himself as a perfectly nice fellow, and who is genuinely disconnected from the impact of his decisions on people. In his first term, President Barack Obama played a cautious manager in navigating the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression and cleaning up the messes left by President George W. Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan. President George W. Bush is the first American president to call openly for two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Shock, confusion, fear, anger, grief, and defiance. On September 11, 2001, and for the 3 days following the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil, President George W. Bush led with raw emotion that reflected the public's whipsawing stages of acceptance. It's a coup by the GOP to grab the governorship to California to make this place a safe haven for George W. Bush in 2004. It's incredible when you think about it. The recall cost the state $100 million. George W. Bush is like a bad comic working the crowd, a moron, if you'll pardon the expression. This book here, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, in it, I put together a case against George Bush that could result, it absolutely could result in his being prosecuted for first-degree murder in an American courtroom. You know, no one will ever accuse me as having the same policies as George W. Bush. In 2003, I wrote a New York Times bestseller called Shut Up Sing, in which I criticized celebrities like the Dixie Chicks Barbra Streisand who were trashing then-President George W. Bush. I have used a variation of that title for more than 15 years to respond to performers who sound off on politics. I think George W. Bush has a warm, engaging personality, but, you know, the presidency is more than just a popularity contest. My journalistic mission was straightforward, to await the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Nobody knew quite when this would be, but the diplomacy, the meetings in the UN Security Council, the allegations about weapons of mass destruction, the martial language of Tony Blair and George W. Bush, all suggested a war was brewing. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.